20 years ago today, on March 31st, 2001, the Sega Dreamcast was officially discontinued, and after almost 2 decades in the console business, Sega would no longer develop consoles going forward and would transition into a third-party publisher. This was definitely one of the most significant events in video game history because the idea of Sega just being done with consoles forever, it was unbelievable. It's like if Microsoft said that we're not making Xbox consoles anymore and we're going to be done with that and we're going to go third party and we're going to release all our Halo games and all our first party games on the PlayStation and the Nintendo Switch. It's just mind-blowing. The fact that games like Sonic the Hedgehog were going to come out on a Nintendo system, it was crazy. It definitely shook up the video game industry, and I guess the writing was on the wall because Sega had been struggling financially for a while at that point. They never really made any money since the end of the Genesis. Their financial woes began with the release of the add-ons for the Genesis, the Sega CD and the 32X. Those were complete failures. And the people in charge at Sega just didn't know what the hell they were doing. There was pretty much a civil war breaking out between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. Both branches of Sega had different visions on what the future of Sega would look like. Sega of America felt like the Genesis still had a few more years left, so that's what the 32X was for, to continue the life cycle of the Genesis and give it more power. While Sega of Japan was like, no, it's time to move on from the Genesis and release the Saturn. There were also plans for other consoles. There was a Sega Neptune that was going to be like a 32X and Genesis combined into one unit, so instead of it being an add-on, you can just buy one console put together. And Sega of America really believed in the 32X, but it didn't really have much of a chance to succeed because not only did you have competitors that started coming in, like the PlayStation in 1995, that was just beyond the power of the Sega Genesis, or even the 32X for that matter. And Sega of Japan realized that. They're like, we need to have a real next-gen console, so hey, Sega of America, you guys can do whatever the hell you want to do. You can release your 32X, whatever the fuck. We're gonna do the Sega Saturn. There was so much inner turmoil, there was so much competing ideas within Sega that they were essentially competing against themselves, never mind competing against Sony and Nintendo. It was just a mess. So as a result, the 32X and the Saturn both failed because there wasn't room for 2 new Sega consoles at the same time, obviously. The trust and faith that consumers had in Sega over the years, especially with the Genesis, it slowly eroded since Sega refused to make a real commitment to their hardware and their platforms. The 32X lasted not even 6 months because that was a total failure. And even the Saturn, that was their real next-gen system that was going to compete with the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. It came out in late 94, and within 3 years, Sega already gave up on it. So imagine getting a brand new Sega Saturn system for Christmas 1997, and within a few months, Sega's announcing a brand new next-gen console in 1998. Are you going to be in a rush to buy their new shit? Of course not. So when people talk about the failure of the Dreamcast and why it didn't really do so well, everyone keeps pointing to the PlayStation 2. It was the PS2 that killed the Dreamcast because it was doing well at first. You know, in 1999, 2000, it was doing alright. Like, the sales were good. They were actually above Sega's initial expectations. Game sales were great. Everything was doing great until the PS2 was released in late 2000. Then, within a few months, Sega's like, we're done. The Dreamcast is done. We're not making consoles anymore. So, yeah, I understand why people tend to focus so much on the PlayStation 2 as the killer of Sega. But it's really Sega's own fault that shit went down the way it did. Because I agree, aside from having a DVD player built into the Dreamcast, there was really nothing that Sega could do to compete with the PS2. Because all the other consoles released in that generation, the original Xbox and Nintendo GameCube, those consoles were failing against the PS2 also. It wasn't just Sega that was doing bad. It was everyone not named Sony that generation. The difference, though, is that Nintendo was in a good financial place, unlike Sega, and Microsoft had unlimited money because they were fucking Microsoft. They rule the world. If you actually take a look, if you actually break down the sales numbers for each of the consoles in that generation, including the Dreamcast was able to sell 9 million units within 2 years in the market. It's actually not that bad, considering that the GameCube in 5 years only sold about 20 million units, and the original Xbox in the same time period sold $25 million. So you could argue that if the Dreamcast was never discontinued and Sega was able to find a way to just hold on, it could have matched the sales of the Xbox and GameCube. But I guess Sega just couldn't hold on. They had to discontinue the Dreamcast. They had to just drop out of the console market, cut their losses, and move on because they were just hemorrhaging money at that point. They were really in dire straits, so they had to do what they had to do to survive. But imagine if the Dreamcast was able to hold on. Imagine if it survived, and imagine if Sega survived. I made a whole video exploring that possibility. What if Sega was still in the console market? I think in that video I said that Microsoft probably wouldn't exist in the console space if Sega was able to hold on, because there wouldn't really be any room for 4 console manufacturers at once. And also, prior to the release of the original Xbox, Sega and Microsoft had some sort of working relationship where Windows was able to be booted on the Dreamcast. So, yeah, I don't think that there would have been any room for Sega and Microsoft to both exist in the console space. But it's fun to imagine how things would have played out if Sega was still in the console business in 2021. And it gets really interesting when you compare Sega's success and failures to Nintendo. You had the Wii U, which came out last generation, and it sold about 13 million units in about 5 years. That's how long the Wii U lasted, and it was a bust. But think about that. In 2 years, Sega was able to sell 9 million Dreamcasts, but in 5 years, Nintendo was only able to sell 13 million Wii U's. You see a lot of comparisons between the Dreamcast and Wii U in online discussions because there are a lot of similarities between those two consoles. Both consoles had a pretty decent library for a system that was a complete failure. I mean, look at the Nintendo Switch. Half the games on that system that are very successful are Wii U ports. So both systems had really good games. It was just the way it was marketed and the way that it handled itself against the competition. It fell flat completely. But the thing about Nintendo is that they had enough cash to keep on going. I think that's the big takeaway for the end of Sega as a console manufacturer, is that they just didn't have anything to fall back on. They didn't really have any major success outside of the Genesis. It's crazy to think, but it's true. They were making consoles for 18 years, from 1983 to 2001. Their first console was the SG-1000. The Genesis was the only real success Sega ever had, which is a lot different from Nintendo because at the same time that the Wii U was failing, the 3DS was thriving. And of course, they also had the Wii, which came out the previous generation that was just so successful, they didn't have to worry about going bankrupt anytime soon. But even the mid-90s to mid-2000s, Nintendo wasn't doing so well as a console manufacturer either. Nintendo 64 wasn't a huge success. It was not a failure by any stretch of the imagination, but it really wasn't as successful as Nintendo hoped for it to be, and the GameCube was actually a failure. But Nintendo was able to keep on going because they had those handhelds to fall back on. The Nintendo DS was out around the same time as the GameCube, and that system was doing incredibly well. So Nintendo never really had to worry about losing so much money that they had to quit and go third party. The interesting thing is that Nintendo has said in recent years that if their consoles aren't making money anymore, they are prepared to do that, to go third party and to make games for all platforms. They're more than willing to do that if the business makes sense. But for now, their consoles are still doing well. The Switch is a huge success, and they're not going away anytime soon. But it's just interesting to draw comparisons, especially with Nintendo and Sega being embroiled in such a fierce rivalry for so many years. Now these days, every new Sonic game comes out on Nintendo systems. I'm sure if you're a gamer that grew up during the early to mid-90s, you're still amazed by that fact, that there is no more war between Sega and Nintendo, and they actually have a really good working relationship these days. But despite the Dreamcast's lack of success and very short lifespan, its legacy lives on 20 years later. It was a console with a fantastic library of games that people still play to this day. The game you're seeing right now, Sonic Adventure 2, is one of those games. It was actually supposed to be the last game in the Sonic franchise. Sonic was supposed to end with Sonic Adventure 2, but when they went third party, they started making games for more systems, like Sonic Advance for the GBA, and Sonic Heroes, that was the first big multi-platform release. But to think that it was all going to end, the entire Sonic franchise was going to die with Sonic Adventure 2, maybe it would have been better if that's how things turned out, because Honestly, once Sega went third party, the quality in games, especially in the Sonic franchise, it dropped dramatically. But the Dreamcast wasn't just Sonic the Hedgehog. People talk about Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 very often, for good reason. They're really good games, but the Dreamcast had so much more to offer than just that. You had amazing arcade ports like Soul Calibur and Crazy Taxi. There were plenty of action games like Shenmue that was groundbreaking for its time. And the Dreamcast actually had some pretty strong third-party support up until its discontinuation, ironically. The third-party support we got on the Dreamcast was a lot stronger than what we had on the Wii U, for example. And we can't forget about SegaNet, the most advanced and robust online infrastructure that we've ever had on a console at that point. Way before Xbox Live was even a thought. The Dreamcast had so much untapped potential. Unfortunately, Sega was unable to realize that potential, so 20 years later, we mourn the death of the Dreamcast. Rest in peace. Gone, but definitely not forgotten.